The station was called the Ardent Horizon, and on paper, it was a beautiful thing. It floated at the edge of the Cathara system, a wide ring of metal and light turning slowly against the dark. It had been built by 4 species together, the Thessali, the Voron, the Ilkai, and the humans, and the idea behind it was simple enough. Scientists from all 4 species would live and work side by side. They would study the strange twin stars at the center of the system, share their findings, and prove to the rest of the galaxy that cooperation between species was not just possible, but good. That was the idea. The reality was a little different. The human crew was small, 12 people in a station of over 200. They ate at a separate corner of the common hall, not because anyone had told them to, but because no one had ever made room for them anywhere else. They did their jobs, filed their reports, and kept mostly to themselves. The other species were polite, in the way that people are polite to someone they do not particularly want to be around. Polite, but not warm. Tolerant, but not welcoming. The Thessali, in particular, had a quiet and unspoken reason for keeping their distance from humans. The Thessali were neuroempaths. It was not a skill they trained, it was simply how their minds worked. When a Thessali stood near another living being, they could feel the edges of that being's emotional state, the way a person on a warm day can feel heat rising from the ground. It was passive, constant, and entirely natural to them. They used it without thinking. It was how they understood each other, how they communicated the things that words were too slow or too clumsy to carry. Humans, however, produced nothing. Or that was what the Thessali believed. When a Thessali stood near a human, their empathic sense returned a flat, dull hum. No emotion, no resonance, no signal at all. Like standing next to a wall. The Thessali had a word for it, Veth. It meant something close to static. Humans were Veth, readable as nothing, emotional as stone. Most Thessali found this unsettling. Some found it rude, in a way they couldn't quite explain. A mind that gave nothing back felt to them like a person who refused to look you in the eye. Vyra had grown up hearing this, and she believed it, because she had experienced it herself every single day for the 8 months she had been stationed on the Ardent Horizon. She was a junior xenobiologist, young by Thessali standards, though experienced enough to have earned her place on a station like this one. Her research focused on the unusual radiation patterns emitted by the twin stars, and how those patterns interacted with the biological tissue of different species. It was careful, detailed work, and she was good at it. Her lab was on the 3rd ring of the station, a long, narrow room full of sample containers, resonance equipment, and the faint blue glow of her analysis arrays. She spent most of her hours there, and she was content. The human liaison assigned to the science division was a man named Jake Ellis. He was not remarkable in any way that Vyra could identify. He was average in height, average in the quietness of how he moved, average in the way he dressed and spoke and occupied space. He had dark hair that was always a little untidy, and eyes that were a shade of brown that Vyra had no specific word for. He did his job without complaint and without apparent enthusiasm. He attended briefings, submitted his reports on time, and when he was not needed, he disappeared somewhere into the human quarter of the station. He had been assigned to her division specifically as a support liaison, which meant in practice that he handled the things Vyra and the other Thessali scientists preferred not to deal with. Maintenance requests, equipment logistics, the long bureaucratic forms that the station's administration required whenever anything in a lab needed to be changed or repaired. He was, in the most straightforward sense, useful. He was also Veth. Vyra had tried once, out of pure scientific curiosity, to sense something from him. She had stood close to him in the lab while he was adjusting the temperature controls on her sample storage unit, close enough that she should have felt at least a surface impression of whatever was moving through his mind. Not even the faint biological warmth she sometimes caught from the Voron, who were also considered poor empathic transmitters. Jake Ellis had been as emotionally present to her senses as the wall behind him. She had given up after that, and simply accepted what everyone accepted. Humans were static. There was nothing to read. 8 months passed. He brought her things she needed before she asked for them. He adjusted the lab temperature. She ran warm for a Thessaly, without being told. He left a cup of the mineral tea she preferred near her workstation on late shift evenings. Always the right temperature. Always without comment. She had assumed this was protocol. She had assumed someone had briefed him on Thessaly preferences, and he was simply following a list somewhere. She had never thanked him for any of it. She had never thought to. The day everything changed started the same way every day on the ardent horizon started. Vira arrived at her lab, checked her overnight analysis results, and began setting up the resonance calibration array she used to maintain the sensitivity of her empathic senses. Thessaly neuroempaths had to calibrate regularly, the way a person might stretch or exercise. Without it, their senses became unreliable. The equipment helped them do it precisely. The calibration itself took about 10 minutes and was entirely routine. Vira had done it hundreds of times. She had not accounted for the power surge. It was small, a fluctuation in the station's main grid, the kind that happened a few times a month and never caused any real damage. The lights in her lab dimmed for half a second. Her sample unit clicked as it adjusted. The resonance array, however, was a different matter. It was tuned to her specific frequency, and when the surge moved through it, it didn't simply flicker, it amplified. For exactly 4 seconds, the array pushed her empathic senses far beyond anything she had ever experienced or been trained for. It was like having been looking through a small, careful window, and then the whole wall disappearing at once. The lab exploded with sensation. She felt the Voron technician 2 rooms over. Anxiety, mild, about a deadline. She felt the distant pulse of the Ilkai crew on the far ring. She felt the station itself, somehow, as a low mechanical hum that had its own strange emotional texture. And she felt Jake Ellis. He was standing at the supply station, 12 meters down the corridor, filing a maintenance request on a small datapad, completely unaware of her. She expected static. She did not get static. What she got hit her like a wave she had not been standing ready for. Structured, layered, and unmistakably deliberate. The sensation lasted 4 seconds, and then the array corrected itself, and everything went quiet again. Vira stood in the middle of her lab, completely still, for a long time. When Jake passed her door a few minutes later and glanced in to check if she needed anything, she did not answer him. She could not find the words. She barely heard him leave. She was still thinking about what she had felt, and what it meant that he had been hiding it. Vira did not sleep that night. She lay in her bunk in the quiet dark of her quarters and stared at the ceiling, and she went over those 4 seconds again and again, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts. It always did. Every time she replayed it, the same feeling came back, that wave, structured and heavy, and completely unlike anything she had ever touched from another mind. She needed to understand it. That was simply who she was. She was a scientist. She did not leave things unexamined. So, she examined it. The first thing she tried to do was explain it away. Power surges affected equipment unpredictably. The array had been pushed far beyond its normal range. Maybe what she had felt was distortion, noise shaped by the malfunction, into something that only seemed meaningful. Maybe she had felt nothing real at all, and her trained mind had simply tried to construct a pattern out of chaos, the way eyes find faces in clouds. She sat with that explanation for about an hour. Then she set it aside, because she knew it was not true. Vira had been a neuroempath her entire life. She had been formally trained for 11 years. She knew the difference between distortion and signal the way a musician knows the difference between a broken string and a wrong note. What she had felt from Jake Ellis had been a signal. Clear, consistent, and deliberate. She was certain of it, in the way she was certain of very few things. Which brought her to the second problem, the one that was harder to sit with. He had been suppressing it, not hiding it the way a person hides a feeling by changing the subject or leaving the room. Suppressing it, actively, continuously, at every moment, the way you might hold a heavy door shut against wind that is always pushing from the other side. The structure she had felt in those 4 seconds was not the structure of a mind at rest. It was the structure of a mind doing work, constant work, the kind of work that left no visible sign on the outside. Vira got up and sat at her small desk, and pulled up everything she could find in the station's shared scientific database about human neurology and emotional physiology. She read for 3 hours. What she found did not make it easier to explain. Humans, according to every HFY study she could access, had no empathic tradition. They had no cultural training in resonance suppression. They had no biological mechanism for it that anyone had identified. The studies were consistent and confident. Humans produced emotional resonance the same as any other species with a functioning limbic system, but they produced it in a frequency band that Thessaly's senses simply could not detect. That was the accepted explanation for the static. Not that humans felt nothing, just that they broadcast on a channel no Thessaly was built to receive. But that explanation had a problem now, a very specific problem. If the static was simply a matter of mismatched frequencies, then what Vira had felt during the surge should have been nothing, just a louder version of the same silence. An amplified signal on a channel she couldn't hear would still be silence. You could turn up the volume on a blank frequency forever and hear nothing. What she had felt was not silence at a higher volume. It had been a mind. A real, working, complicated mind, full of the specific textures that minds have when they are actively directed at something. It had not been a broadcast she was suddenly able to receive. It had been a suppression that had, for 4 seconds, slipped. He had been holding it back, deliberately, every day, for 8 months, in her presence. She sat with that for a long time. Why would a human, a species with no empathic training, no cultural reason to understand what suppression even was, or why it would matter, choose to do something that difficult, that consistently, for that long? She started writing things down. Not conclusions, just questions. She filled a full page of her personal log with questions, before she stopped and looked at what she had written and noticed something. Almost every question she had written was a version of the same question. It just kept coming back, dressed in different words. Why was he doing it for her? Because that was the other thing she had felt in those 4 seconds. The thing she had been trying to set aside, because it was harder to examine than the suppression itself. The emotional shape inside Jake Ellis's mind had not been directionless. It had not been a general ambient state. It had been oriented, pointed at something with the steady, worn quality of something that had been pointed at the same thing for a very long time. It had been pointed at her, not in a way that frightened her. There had been nothing sharp in it, nothing hungry, nothing that resembled the particular shape of obsession, which Vira knew how to recognize. Her training had covered it extensively. This was different. It was more like a lighthouse beam than a searchlight, not seeking, just illuminating, returning rotation after rotation to the same point, her safety, her position, whether she was all right. She thought about the tea. She thought about the temperature adjustments. She thought about all the small things he had done, quietly and without comment, that she had categorized as protocol and never thought about again. She thought about the way he always arrived a few minutes before her shift began, even on his off days. She had noticed it vaguely, the way you vaguely notice the furniture arrangement in a room you've walked through many times. She had not considered that it might mean something. She was considering it now. In the morning, she went to her lab and tried to work. She ran her analysis sequences, checked her sample readings, and entered her overnight data into the main research log. She did all of this on the surface of herself, because underneath, she was still thinking. He came through the door with a data pad in one hand and a small container of her mineral tea in the other, and he set the tea down near her workstation without breaking stride, without looking over to see if she noticed, without any indication that he expected acknowledgement of any kind. She watched him settle at the logistics desk across the lab and start on the morning's maintenance filings, and she felt something strange move through her. A feeling she didn't have a clean name for because it sat between several things at once. She had spent 8 months looking at him and seeing nothing. She was beginning to understand that the nothing had been the whole point. He had not wanted her to see. He had arranged it carefully so she would not. A human, a species that by every record she had ever read was not even supposed to understand what resonance was, had taken deliberate steps to protect a Thessali empath from the weight of his own mind. She didn't know yet what he had been protecting her from, exactly. She didn't know the full shape of it. She only knew that the shape existed, and that it was large, and that she had been walking past it every day for 8 months, without ever once looking at it directly. She picked up her tea. It was exactly the right temperature, the way it always was. Vira started with the maintenance logs, because they were the easiest place to begin. Every repair request, every equipment check, every adjustment made to any system on the ardent horizon was recorded in the station's central log, with a timestamp, a location, and the name of the person who submitted it. It was a dry, dull archive that almost nobody ever looked at, unless something broke badly enough to require an investigation. Vira had never opened it before in 8 months of living on the station. She opened it now and searched for Jake Ellis's name. The results filled her screen. She had expected a normal amount. A liaison officer handled logistics, so a certain number of requests was simply part of the job. What she had not expected was the pattern. She sat forward slowly as she began to read through the entries, one by one, and the picture they painted was not the picture of a man doing his job. It was the picture of a man doing something much quieter and much more careful than that. 6 weeks after Jake had arrived on the station, he had submitted a maintenance request for a coolant line that ran through the wall behind Vira's lab. The request described a minor irregularity in the pressure readings, nothing urgent, nothing that would have flagged automatically on any system check. The line had been inspected and adjusted. Vira had never known about it. She had never felt any difference in her lab. 3 months later, a coolant line in the engineering bay on the far side of the station had ruptured. It had caused significant damage to 2 storage rooms and had put 4 crew members in the medical bay for minor injuries. The engineering report noted that the line had been showing irregular pressure for weeks before it failed. The line behind Vira's lab and the ruptured engineering line were part of the same network, the same age, the same design. If the one behind her lab had not been caught and adjusted early, the engineers estimated it would have failed within the same window. She sat with that for a moment. Then she kept reading. There were 3 anonymous safety reports filed through the station's open reporting system over the past 8 months, a system that allowed any crew member to flag a concern without attaching their name to it. The reports were supposed to be genuinely anonymous, but the station's internal filing protocol assigned each anonymous report a routing code based on the terminal it was submitted from. And Vira was a scientist who knew how to follow a data trail. All 3 reports had been submitted from the logistics terminal in her lab. Jake's terminal. His off-shift hours matched the submission times exactly. All 3 reports had flagged safety issues in areas directly adjacent to her research spaces. None had ever been connected to him by anyone. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window and looked out at the dark for a while. The twin stars of the Ketharos system glowed, soft and distant, orange and pale white, turning slowly around each other, the way they had been doing for billions of years before anyone was watching. She looked at them without really seeing them. Then she went back to her desk and kept reading, because she was not done yet. The hardest entry to find was the one she almost missed. It was buried in the administrative records, rather than the maintenance logs, a section of the archive she had to request special research access to open, which she did without hesitation, using her senior science credentials. It was a file from 6 months ago, flagged as resolved and archived, and it was labeled with the dry, neutral language that bureaucratic documents always use to describe things that were not dry or neutral at all. It was a formal reassignment recommendation, filed by Commander Doss, recommending that Vira be transferred off the Ardent Horizon on grounds of insufficient research productivity and poor integration with the station's scientific community. Vira read it twice. The language was careful and professional and completely dishonest. Her productivity numbers were strong. She knew this because she tracked them herself. Her research output over the previous 4 months had been above the station average. The claim of poor integration was vaguer and harder to disprove on paper, which was almost certainly why Doss had chosen it. The recommendation had required a co-signature from the human administrative officer on duty, standard cross-species protocol, designed so that no single species could unilaterally reassign a crew member from another. That officer had been Jake. He had not co-signed. Instead, he had filed a counterbrief. She found it attached to the original recommendation, 14 pages long, written in the flat, precise language of someone who had been very careful to keep all personal feeling out of it. It cited her specific research outputs, her data contribution rate, her collaborative reports with the Ilkai science team. It compared her numbers to the station average and to the averages of the previous 2 xenobiology liaisons who had held her position. It was thorough in the way that something is thorough when the person writing it understands exactly what is at stake, and has decided that thoroughness is the only weapon available to them. The recommendation had died in committee 3 days after Jake filed the counterbrief. It had never been reopened. Vira had never known it existed. She had gone about her work for the last 6 months without knowing that her place on this station had almost been taken from her, and that a quiet human man at a desk in her lab had stopped it from happening with 14 pages of careful, precise, completely anonymous effort. She closed the archive. She sat very still for a long time. She thought about Commander Doss. She had always found him cold toward her, but she had told herself it was simply the impersonal manner of a senior officer. She had explained it away, the way she had explained away so many things. She was good at explaining things away. She was a scientist, and scientists were trained to withhold judgment until the evidence was sufficient. She had sufficient evidence now. She also had a question she needed to ask, and there was only one person on the station she thought might be able to answer it honestly. Not Jake, not yet. She needed to understand something first, before she spoke to him. She needed to know if anyone else had seen what she was only now beginning to see. She found Nina Cole in the medical bay, restocking supply cabinets at the end of her shift. Nina was the station's human medic, calm, practical, with the kind of steady manner that people in her profession often developed over years of working in stressful places. She and Jake had joined the station in the same intake group, and Vira had seen them eat together in the common hall on occasion. Vira asked her, carefully and without revealing the logs or the calibration surge, whether she had ever noticed Jake behaving in ways that seemed unusual, whether he had ever done things she couldn't explain. Nina stopped what she was doing. She turned around and looked at Vira with an expression that was patient and a little sad and not at all surprised. She said, "Yeah, that sounds like Jake." Vira asked why he never told anyone, why he never said a word about any of it. Mina was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Vira, the way you look at someone when you are about to say something simple that is also very hard. He didn't do it, so you'd know. That's not why he did it. Vira walked back to her quarters slowly, through the long curved corridor of the third ring, and she thought about that answer the whole way. It was the most human thing she had ever heard, and somehow, impossibly, it was beginning to make sense. Vira found him in the observation bay. It was the largest open space on the ardent horizon that was not a work area. A wide, curved room on the outer edge of the station's top ring, with a long, transparent wall that looked directly out into space. Most crew members came here during their off hours to sit and think, or to do nothing at all. It was one of the few places on the station that felt genuinely quiet. Jake was sitting alone on one of the low benches near the far end of the viewport, his back straight, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He was watching a slow drift of debris move past the glass, small rocks and dust from the asteroid belt at the system's edge, catching the distant light of the twin stars and glinting for a second before passing into the dark again. He did not hear her come in, or if he did not turn around. She crossed the room and sat down on the bench across from him. His expression was calm, the way it always was. That particular human stillness that she had spent 8 months reading as emptiness, and was only now beginning to understand differently. He did not look surprised to see her. He did not look worried either, which she found interesting, because she had rehearsed this conversation several times on the walk over, and it had felt, in the rehearsal, like the kind of conversation that should worry someone. She did not give him the slow approach she had planned. She did not ease into it carefully, the way she had intended. She simply told him. All of it. The calibration surge, the 4 seconds, what she had felt. She told him about the logs, the coolant line, the anonymous reports, the reassignment recommendation, and the 14-page counterbrief that had killed it. She told him what Mina had said. She spoke plainly, and she kept her eyes on his face the whole time, because she was watching for something, a flinch, a shift, some sign of discomfort at being uncovered. She was watching for the thing people showed when they were caught doing something they had wanted to keep hidden. She did not see that. She saw him listen. That was all. He listened to everything she said with the same steady attention he brought to everything. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands. Then he looked back up at her. The coolant line was a real problem, he said. I checked the pressure reports from the first week I was here. The numbers were off. It wasn't an opinion, it was just math. I put in the request because the alternative was waiting for it to fail. And the reassignment recommendation? Vira asked. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, but the quiet of someone choosing their words carefully because the words mattered to them. When I got here, he said, I spent the first 2 weeks just watching how the station worked. Not the official structure, the real one. Who talked to whom? Who got their requests approved, and who had to submit them 3 times? Who got left out of briefings they should have been in? That kind of thing. He paused. You were good at your job, he said. Better than good. Your numbers were strong, your data was clean. You weren't doing anything wrong, but you were positioned in a way that made you easy to push around. And DOS had been doing small things, not big things, nothing that would show up clearly, just small things, consistently, over time. The kind of thing that adds up if nobody is paying attention. You were paying attention, Vira said. It was my job to pay attention, he said. That means I'm supposed to make sure the people I'm assigned to can do their work. If something is getting in the way of that, I'm supposed to deal with it. The counterbrief was 14 pages, Vira said. Something moved across his face then, not quite a smile, but close to the shape of one. His recommendation had a lot of problems, he said simply. Vira looked at him for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been sitting at the center of everything since the night of the surge. The one she had written down in her log a dozen different ways and never been able to set aside. "Why did you suppress your resonance?" she asked. "Every day, for 8 months. That is not something humans do. That is not something humans are even supposed to know how to do. The effort that requires. I have trained my entire life to understand minds, and I cannot fully explain how a human without any training managed it." "Why did you do it?" He did not answer immediately. He looked out through the viewport at the drifting debris, and she watched him think. Actually watched it, in the way she could sometimes see thinking move through a person's posture and the set of their eyes. "Your people read emotion without choosing to," he said eventually. "You told me that in the first week, when you were explaining Thessaly neurology for the liaison orientation. You said it was passive. You said you couldn't turn it off." "That is correct," Vira said. "So if I was walking around feeling everything I was noticing and tracking every day," he said, "and you couldn't turn off the ability to sense it, that would have been a lot to carry. You didn't ask to know what I was thinking. You were just trying to do your work." It didn't seem fair. Vira was very still. "You did not want me to feel watched over," she said. "I didn't want to make your day harder," he said. "That's all. That's all." He said it the way you say something that is completely obvious to you. Simple and flat, and with no apparent awareness of how large it was. Vira sat with those 2 words, and felt something inside her shift in a way that had no name in any language she knew. She had spent her career studying other species. She had read thousands of pages of xenobiology, xenopsychology, cross-species behavioral analysis. She had always believed, in a quiet and private way that she had never said out loud, that species without empathic ability were working at a disadvantage, that they moved through the world partially blind, bumping into each other's feelings by accident because they could not see them coming. She had felt something close to pity for them, though she would not have used that word. She was sitting across from a man who had no empathic ability, who could not feel her emotional state, could not sense her resonance, could not access any of the information that Thessaly used to understand and care for each other. He had none of the tools, none of the biological equipment, none of the training. And he had looked at her anyway, with his eyes, with his attention, with whatever it was humans used in place of all the things they had not been given. And he had seen her clearly enough to protect her from something she had not even known was threatening her. She did not know what to do with that. She did not have a framework for it. "I looked at the logs," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "All of them. 8 months of them. I know what you did." He met her eyes. "I figured that was why you came." She asked him then, because she had to ask it, because leaving it unasked would have felt dishonest, whether he had ever intended to tell her. Any of it. Ever. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "No," he said. "Probably not." "Why not?" He looked out at the stars again. "Because it wasn't about getting credit," he said. "It was just about whether you were okay. You were okay. That was enough." Vira sat in the quiet of the observation bay for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the station around them. The debris drifted past the glass, slow and glittering and indifferent. She had come here with questions. She had all the answers now. She was not sure the answers had made things simpler. If anything, they had opened into something larger than the questions had been, something she was going to need a long time to fully understand. She understood the most important part. She stood up slowly. Jake looked up at her, easy and unhurried, waiting to see if there was anything else she needed. There was one more thing. She would say it in Part 5. Vira did not write the letter right away. She went back to her quarters after leaving the observation bay, and she sat at her small desk, and she looked at the blank document on her screen for a long time, without typing anything. The cursor blinked at her, patient and indifferent. Outside her window, The twin stars of the Cathara system burned their slow, ancient light across the dark, the same way they had been doing long before the Ardent Horizon was built, long before any of the 4 species aboard it had learned to travel between stars at all. She was not sure where to begin. That was the problem. Vyra had been sending personal correspondence to her mentor Aerith since she was a student. Short messages at first, then longer ones as she grew older, and the things she wanted to say became more complicated. Aerith had been a senior neuroempath at the Thessalai Institute for 40 years. She had studied more species than most Thessalai ever encountered in a lifetime. She was the kind of person who had very few surprises left, and she received Vyra's letters with the calm, attentive warmth of someone who had always known her student was going to run into something she couldn't explain on her own eventually. This was that time. Vyra started typing. She did not begin with Jake. She began with herself, because that felt like the honest place to start. She wrote about the 8 months she had spent on the station. She wrote about the human crew, 12 people in a station of over 200, quiet and contained, giving off nothing that she could read, moving through the shared spaces of the ardent horizon like shapes without weight. She wrote about how quickly she had accepted the idea that they were simply that way, empty, not worth the effort of understanding, because there was nothing there to understand. She wrote that she was ashamed of that now, not in a way that hurt too much to say, just in the clean, clear way that you feel ashamed when you see something plainly after having missed it for a long time. Then she wrote about Jake. She wrote about the tea and the temperature adjustments and all the small daily things she had walked past for 8 months without once stopping to ask why. She wrote about the calibration surge and the 4 seconds and what she had felt when his suppression slipped and the real shape of his mind was briefly visible to her. She tried to describe it in terms that Aerith would understand. The orientation of it, the steadiness, the way it had been pointed outward rather than inward, towards someone else's safety rather than his own comfort. She wrote about the coolant line and what would have happened if he had not caught it. She wrote about the 14 pages he had submitted in quiet, careful defense of her position, and the fact that he had never told her and had never intended to. She wrote what Nina had said, he didn't do it so you'd know. Then she stopped for a while, and looked at what she had written. It was already long. She was not done. She wrote about the conversation in the observation bay. She tried to capture his voice, the flat, unhurried way he spoke, as if the things he was saying were simply obvious, and the only reason to say them at all was because she had asked. She wrote down his exact words as best she could remember them. She wrote about the moment he had explained why he suppressed his resonance, and how he had said it, not as something remarkable, not as something he expected her to thank him for, but as a simple and self-evident decision that any reasonable person would have made. It didn't seem fair. She wrote those 4 words in the letter, and then sat and looked at them for a while. She had tried, since the night of the surge, to think about those words from every angle she could find. She kept arriving at the same place. A human, a member of a species with no empathic ability, no resonance tradition, no biological mechanism for sensing the emotional states of others, had learned just enough about how Thessaly minds worked to understand that his own unshielded emotions might be a burden to the person standing near him. And then he had decided, without being asked, without any expectation of recognition, to carry that burden himself rather than let it land on her. He had not been able to feel what she felt. He had not had access to her inner world, her emotional state, the quiet daily texture of her experience. He had been as closed off from those things as any human was from any Thessalai. He had worked with nothing but his eyes and his attention, and whatever it was that moved inside a human mind when it decided that someone else's well-being mattered. And it had been enough. It had been more than enough. Vyra wrote to Aerith that she had spent her entire career, without quite realizing it, believing something that she had never examined directly. She had believed that connection, Real connection, the kind that meant something, required openness, required the ability to send and receive, required the biological and cultural equipment to reach into another mind and feel what was there. She had believed, in the way you believe things that nobody ever tells you because nobody needs to tell you because everyone around you believes the same thing, that species without empathic ability were always going to be limited in how deeply they could truly know each other. She wrote that she was no longer sure that was true. She wrote that Jake Ellis had known her, really known her, in the way that mattered most, without any of the tools she had always believed were necessary for knowing. He had known the shape of her situation, the weight of her vulnerability on the station, the specific ways in which her position was fragile. He had known it, not because he had felt it, but because he had paid attention, because he had looked and thought, and then quietly done what the looking and thinking told him needed to be done. She wrote that Thessaly empaths spoke often about the gift of open minds, the beauty of a connection that flowed naturally between two people who could feel each other clearly. She had always thought of that openness as the highest form of understanding available to any conscious being. She wrote that she thought she had been wrong. Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete, because what Jake had done was not lesser than empathic connection. It was something else, something that required a different kind of strength and a different kind of dedication, and something she did not have a clean word for in any language she knew. The closest she could get was this: he had chosen to care carefully about someone he could not feel, and he had kept that choice every day, without reward, without acknowledgement, without even the small comfort of knowing that she was aware of him. That was not blindness. That was not the stumbling, accidental kindness of a species that lacked the equipment to do better. That was something she had never fully seen before, and now that she had seen it, she could not unsee it. She finished the letter and sent it before she could think about it too long. Then she went to sleep, and for the first time since the night of the calibration surge, she slept well. Aerith's reply arrived 11 days later, which was fast for a message traveling between systems. This was not unusual. Aerith had always believed that the best responses were the ones that used only as many words as they needed. She wrote, "The distance between minds is not always a wall. Sometimes it is just a space that someone decided to cross anyway. Come home soon." Vira read it twice. Then she saved it. The next morning she went to her lab at her usual time. Jake arrived a few minutes after her, the way he always did. He came in quietly, set her mineral tea down near her workstation without breaking stride, and moved to his desk to start on the day's logistics filings. He did not look at her differently than he ever had. He was exactly the same as he had always been, steady, contained, quietly present. But Vira looked at him differently now. She looked at him the way you look at something you have finally understood, not with drama, not with the big feeling that you expect such moments to carry, but with a kind of calm and clear recognition. Like a shape coming into focus after a long time of being blurry. She picked up the tea. It was exactly the right temperature, the way it always was. "Thank you," she said. Jake looked up from his datapad. For just a moment, something moved across his face, a small, genuine surprise, there and then gone. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded at things that he had registered and understood. He went back to work. She went back to work. The twin stars of the Kethera system burned on outside the viewport, turning slowly around each other, the way they always had. The ardent horizon turned with them, steady and quiet, full of species who were still learning how to see each other.